And when he was speaking about anti-slavery, he became fascinated with the role of women because it was very clear to him when he was in the Midwest that women were the foundation of the movement here. And so that's eventually what led me from Parker Pillsbury, when I finished his book, to Midwestern women abolitionists. I'm going to be focusing today on what we define as the Midwest, but what in the 19th century was really the Old Northwest. That's what they call it, the Old Northwest. And that is these areas I've circled here: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I do touch a little bit on Iowa and Kansas when it's convenient for me, but mostly these are the 5 states that I focus on. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I do just want to let you know that my research has brought me to a variety of different historical societies across the Midwest. I've been to Michigan and to Ohio and to Indiana and to Wisconsin and to historical societies and to libraries and archives. My talk tonight is based on the results of that research, actually at the archives, reading women's letters, but also reading official reports of female anti-slavery societies, reading their records, reading anti-slavery newspapers. So it's a wide variety of sources that I'm going to be employing today. Mostly what I'm going to be talking about are 3 areas of women's role in the anti-slavery movement: politics, the free produce movement, and the Underground Railroad. You probably don't know what the free produce movement is because we generally don't talk about it a lot in anti-slavery scholarship, but hopefully after we leave tonight you will know what that is. You certainly know what the other 2 are, I have no doubt. Let's just give you a little bit of background on the anti-slavery movement itself. Although there had been lots of efforts to free the slaves prior to the 1830s, I'm going to begin in the 1830s with what's known as the immediate emancipation movement, led by William Lloyd Garrison, pictured here. Oh, you can't see the name, but that's Garrison. He was influenced by many African-American abolitionists, one of whom was James Wharton, pictured here, to initiate a movement, an uncompromising movement to end slavery immediately, not gradually over time, not to pay slave owners for their slaves, but to immediately free slaves, because slavery was a sin. And you didn't gradually do away with sins. You immediately did away with sins. And so Garrison was an uncompromising abolitionist. Right after Garrison began the movement, many women immediately joined him. Immediately in the 1830s. Literally hundreds of female anti-slavery societies were created across the North. Of course, not too many in the South, needless to say. Scholars looking at the role of women in the anti-slavery movement have primarily focused on the Northeast, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. We know a lot about women in the Midwest. It's as if they weren't in existence, as if they weren't contributing anything to the movement. And yet there were literally hundreds of women's anti-slavery societies right here in the Midwest, right here, in fact, in central Illinois, which was believe it or not, a hotbed of women's anti-slavery activity. And so lately, they organized, they shared pamphlets, they petitioned the government, and so their activities were wide-ranging. Around 1840, the anti-slavery movement across the North experienced a big divide. It broke up the movement. It was a very dramatic divide. And there were 2 issues over which the movement divided. One was the role of women. The role of women divided the anti-slavery movement. One issue in particular was what role were women going to play in anti-slavery societies and in speaking. Women like the Brinke sisters, I don't know how many of you have heard of Angelina and Sarah Brinke, but they're actually quite famous women abolitionists of the 19th century. They're famous in part because they were from the South. They were actually, they came from slaveholding families from South Carolina. And they both eventually ended up moving north, becoming Quakers, and joining the abolitionist movement. Because of their experience with slavery, their first-hand contact with slavery, when they began lecturing, their audiences were just full. And initially, they only spoke to women. their audience, it was called a promiscuous audience. So women were only expected to speak to women. Well, the Grimm Case Sisters were so popular that men began attending their lectures. And so those lectures became co-ed and promiscuous. Now once that happened, many ministers who were active in the anti-slavery movement began to, I tend to wander, and I can see that I'm going to wander from my image there. Many ministers began to basically speak out against women lecturing before promiscuous audiences, and really to tell women your role in the movement is behind the scenes. You should not be out front lecturing. That's the role for ministers, not the role for women. You should be sewing and praying and singing, but not speaking up front. Well, many women said, forget it. We're going to do what we're going to do, and we have an important role in the movement. And so there was this divide over what role the women had. Many abolitionists supported the women. Many women actually supported the ministers and said, you're right, women should not be publicly lecturing. That's not women's roles. So it wasn't just a male-female divide at all. I told you there were two things that divided the movement. It wasn't just the role of women, it was also the appropriate method for achieving anti-slavery. Up until this time period, pretty much everybody agreed the best way to achieve anti-slavery was moral suasion. That is, to convince slaveholders themselves, slavery is a sin, right? To use moral suasion. Well, around this time, a lot of people began to realize, you know what? It's not working. The slaveholders don't believe this. They're not going to give up their slaves because we tell them it's a sin. We need to do something else. And so they created a political party called the Liberty Party in 1840. And this political party was designed to attack slavery through the political system. Now, many abolitionists, including William Lloyd Garrison and the Grimm Case Sisters, were totally against political parties. They believed that once you stepped into politics, you were stepping into corruption and immorality and sinfulness, that the anti-slavery movement could not get involved in politics. And so the movement divided into those who advocated the Liberty Party and politics and those who advocated moral suasion still, staying away from politics. Now, women, most historians have argued, after 1840, after this divide, began to leave the anti-slavery movement. They began to do other things, get involved with temperance, for example, other kinds of reform. Now, what I'm going to argue is that that's not true in the Midwest, that women did not leave the movement. Historians say they left the movement because there was no place left for them. They couldn't get involved with the Liberty Party. That's a political party. Women weren't supposed to get involved with politics. The folks who advocated moral suasion, at least one group of them, were the very same ministers who were telling women that their role in the movement was to be quiet, right, to work behind the scenes. There was only one other group, also moral suasionists, William Lloyd Garrison and the Garrisonians, who advocated women's equality within the movement and moral suasion. Now, many women did side with the Garrisonians and find a place within that movement. But for many women, especially women in the Midwest, the Garrisonians were simply too radical for them. Because the Garrisonians not only advocated equality for women within the anti-slavery movement, they advocated equality for women in society. And at that time, that's a pretty radical notion. They also advocated racial equality. And this was also fairly radical. And so for many women, there didn't seem to be an option. But I'm going to argue that in the Midwest, women did find a place. They found a place in politics, they found a place in the free produce movement, and they found a place in the Underground Railroad. Okay, let's talk about politics for a moment. Mary Davis exemplified the kind of outspoken woman abolitionist I hoped I would find in my research. But at first, she eluded me because she signed her letters to the Western Citizen, which was a Chicago-based Liberty Party newspaper, only with her initials, as pictured here, MED. A white resident of Peoria, the mysterious MED intrigued me, not only because she's from Peoria, Illinois, where I was and still am living, but also because of her outspoken title, Duty of a Christian Abolitionist. Her letters generally represented female concerns, right? The immorality of slavery, the cruel physical and mental abuse of slaves, the religious nature of anti-slavery. And so at first, her letters were not that interesting, but soon it became clear to me that Davis was, in fact, writing about political conventions of the Whig and Liberty parties, which she clearly had attended. You can see pictured here Davis's letter about the Great Whig Convention at Peoria. She eventually began encouraging women to embrace a more public and political role in the anti-slavery movement. But who was she? When I finally ran across a notice of a meeting of the Peoria Female Anti-Slavery Society, which I couldn't believe existed, quite honestly, signed by its secretary, Mary B. Davis, I knew I had found my mysterious correspondence. Mary Davis grew up in the South. She, like the Linkay sisters, grew up on a plantation, an example of which is pictured here. She was the daughter of a Virginia slaveholder, and her youth was enmeshed in the Southern plantation system. In fact, she credits her slave nanny with making her an abolitionist, interestingly enough. And this is one of the ways in which my research is really beginning to make me rethink the common knowledge about the anti-slavery movement among historians, because most historians will tell you that everyone involved in the abolitionist movement was from the North, especially those in the day. Everybody had come from the Northeast, right? And yet here I'm finding all these women, especially in the Midwest, who grew up in the South, which I think is really intriguing. And Mary Davis is one of those people. By the way, if you're interested in Mary Davis, the only real published information on her is a book called Fighters for Freedom, which was published by Herman Mulder, who was a professor of history at Knox College. By the way, I am friends with his son, Owen. Herman Mulder has since passed away, but his son actually works at Knox College also, and is just about to get together on the Underground Railroad in Central Illinois. So that's kind of an interesting tradition passed down from father to son of this interest in Central Illinois abolitionism. Anyway, so Mary Davis grew up in Virginia. She eventually married journalist and editor Samuel Davis. She had 5 sons. They moved to Peoria in 1837, and they began publishing the Peoria Register, one of the first newspapers in Peoria. Mary had already openly avowed her anti-slavery credentials. She was clear with her husband and those around her she was an abolitionist, but her husband was not an abolitionist. In fact, he owned at this time 2 slaves back in Virginia. So you can see the potential for family conflict here. Despite this family difficulty here, Mary continued to forge a very important role in the anti-slavery movement. She began writing letters to anti-slavery newspapers, which is how I found her, from those letters that she wrote to the Western Citizen. And by 1843, she had helped to create a female anti-slavery society in Peoria. It was in this year, in fact, 1843, that her husband was converted to anti-slavery. But what's interesting about his conversion is that it wasn't his wife that converted him to anti-slavery. It was, in fact, a mob that converted him to anti-slavery. Samuel Davis, as I mentioned, was the editor and publisher of the newspaper in Peoria. Well, around 1843, some men got together and decided they were going to form an anti-slavery society in Peoria, just like the women had already done. Well, when they attempted to meet, I believe it was at the Presbyterian Church in downtown Peoria, on Main Street, a mob stopped them from meeting, an example of which is, you can see here. A mob stopped them from meeting, broke up the meeting. The mob, the anti-abolitionists, held their own meeting and passed resolutions saying to the people of Peoria that not only would there be no more abolitionist meetings in Peoria, but there would be no more publications of any notices of any anti-slavery activity in the newspapers of Peoria. And this is what got Samuel Davis. Samuel Davis said, "You can't tell me what to publish in my newspaper. Have you ever heard of free speech?" And so it was this mob that actually turned turned him toward anti-slavery, made him become more sympathetic, and eventually he became a very outspoken abolitionist. So, Mary and her husband are both becoming involved in anti-slavery. In the mid-1840s, Mary Davis not only helped to form the Peoria Female Anti-Slavery Society, but she also helped to form a state female anti-slavery society, the Illinois State Female Anti-Slavery Society, and its first meeting was held right here in central Illinois in Peoria. And Mary Davis was a leader in that movement. And it was right around this time that Mary Davis began to become more active in the Liberty Party and politics, which was what really brought her to my attention. The Liberty Party in the North was not very welcoming to anyone who believed primarily that the anti-slavery movement should only focus on morality. In the Midwest, however, the Liberty Party embraced pretty much anybody who called themselves an abolitionist. They were very welcoming to both moral abolitionists and political abolitionists. And what this ended up doing was allowing for women to play a role in politics. Because the morality issue, which was associated with anti-slavery, allowed them to step into the Liberty Party. Because women were primarily considered moral beings. And any action that women took on behalf of morality was perfectly fine, right? And so women kind of used morality to sneak into politics, to sneak into the Liberty Party. Mary Davis and many other women abolitionists, in fact, became so good at subtly squeaking into the movement in all kinds of different ways. They encouraged women to use their, what they called special female influence. They talked a lot about female influence to affect the tide of public opinion. Quote, a woman has influence, and directing that influence in the proper channel, she can affect mighty things, declared Mary Davis. Who shall set the bounds of the influence of an intelligent and virtuous female? Asked one correspondent to the Michigan-based newspaper Signal of Freedom in 1845. Quote, you need not make a great public parade, but you can consistently and without overstepping the bounds of etiquette, plead with your son even in the same building. Any product that slaves had made, cotton, sugar, tobacco, anything that had been made in the slave South should be boycotted. It was basically an economic boycott of slavery. That's what it was, an economic boycott of slavery. Its advocates hoped basically that as more and more Northerners began to reject the products of the slave South, that slavery would die out. It would be economically killed by this boycott. As with most wings of the anti-slavery movement, men dominated leadership positions within free produce. And you can imagine why. I mean, free produce is about the market system, it's about business, it's about economics. These are all masculine kinds of arenas, or at least considered masculine kinds of arenas. And yet, despite this discouragement, women abolitionists employed traditional ideas about femininity to forge a role within the anti-slavery movement. Much like the women who got involved with the Liberty Party, remember they used their influence to encourage women to get involved with politics? Well, women like Elizabeth Chandler did the same thing. They encouraged women to use their influence to encourage men to become free produce advocates. Elizabeth Chandler was actually born and raised in New England, but in the 1830s she moved to the Michigan frontier. And Michigan in the 1830s really was the frontier. There was nothing there except for woods. Anyway, she moved to the frontier, and she continued her role in the anti-slavery movement. She had been a very important thinker and writer in the anti-slavery movement before moving to Michigan. She wrote a ladies' column in the Genius of Universal Emancipation, which was an anti-slavery newspaper, and she really articulated the two primary reasons why women should get involved in the anti-slavery movement. One was something that I alluded to earlier, morality. She and most Americans at the time believed that women were morally superior to men. Quite simply. Women were moral beings. our mothers. It was a connection no one could deny, they believed. And how could northern white free women watch southern black slave mothers have their children torn away from them? What mother could allow that to happen without stepping up and stating their position against that? And so she argued morality and motherhood forced all true women to become abolitionists. And this had a really powerful effect on women. Elizabeth Chandler also began to advocate the free produce movement. And she believed that women were the best people to be active behind the free produce movement because, let's face it, who is it that really purchases goods? Women. Right? It's women who are purchasing the goods. Even in the 19th century, even when there were Kroger's on the corner to go purchase your stuff at, women, when they did purchase goods, were the ones who were generally making the decisions to purchase goods. And so she advocated the free produce movement. She also became, once she moved to Michigan, a leader in the anti-slavery movement in Michigan. In fact, she was absolutely relentless. Elizabeth Chandler was so relentless that when there were like 3 families in the entire county that she lived in, Logan County, she managed to get them all together and have them create a free produce society. You know, all whatever, 8 adults. She would literally, I remember reading one letter where she was writing to her aunt, and she was talking about just walking down this kind of old frontier road, and she runs into a new family that's moving into the area. And she begins talking to them. Within like 20 minutes, they're free produce advocates. You know, I mean, she's converted them immediately. I mean, you can imagine that being around Elizabeth Chandler would get a little irritating after a while because she was such just a passionate advocate of anti-slavery and the free produce movement. Unfortunately for the advocates of free produce, however, Elizabeth Chandler died in 1835. She was quite young. I believe she was only about 32 years old. She died of one of the many diseases that passed through the area. But the free produce movement did not die with her. There were many really passionate advocates of free produce right here in the Midwest, particularly actually among the Quakers in Indiana, particularly in Newport and Henry County. The Newport, Indiana Female Anti-Slavery Society, for example, passed a resolution explaining to the world why they strongly supported free labor, or free labor and free produce are basically the same thing. Quote, any moderate degree of reflection might convince any person that the purchase of slave labor is deeply implicated in the guilt of slaveholding. Right? She's basically saying, you don't even have to think too hard to figure out buying cotton is supporting the slave system. The Henry County women were even more bold in their statements. They said, they resolved in 1843, quote, those who purchase and consume the products of slavery must be regarded as the principal supporters of the whole slave system. If you buy cotton, you are as bad as a slaveholder, they're saying. It followed quite naturally that any such people could not possibly be true abolitionists. These women confidently declared that wearing clothes made of slave plantation cotton or eating cake with Southern sugar was not only irresponsible, it was a pro-slavery action. This was a fairly uncompromising position, considering how difficult it was to gain access to free produce during this time period. While there were increasing numbers of grocery stores in the Midwest, there were very few free labor stores at all in the Midwest, in fact, across the nation. For me, I think about it kind of like, 20 years ago trying to find organic produce, right? It was very hard to find organic produce 20 years ago, and if you did find it, you had to pay a lot for it, right? So it's not just that free labor produce was hard to find, it was expensive. You had to pay twice as much or more to get a free labor shirt, which was cotton that wasn't even as good as the Southern cotton, so it was kind of, scratchy. So you had to pay a lot for a scratchy shirt. That really didn't appeal to a lot of people. But the Henry County women and the Newport women were quite uncompromising. Needless to say, the free produce movement was not quite as successful as they would have hoped. It wasn't very successful at all, in fact, which is probably why you haven't heard much about it. But nonetheless, women like the Indiana women were very important leaders within that movement. The Henry County women to assist fugitive slaves as they escaped from the South on the Underground Railroad. Quote, "It is our duty," they resolved in 1843, "to assist the wayward traveler on his journey from the land of oppression to the land of liberty." Their efforts to aid the Underground Railroad included raising funds, sewing clothes, donating food, and even housing fugitives. Many other women's organizations also supported the Underground Railroad. Sometimes entitled benevolent associations or sewing societies, these groups met regularly to sew or cook together for fugitives. Their benign aims and their domestic duty, which helped to keep them within the traditional feminine framework, made them much less likely to be noticed by anybody, right? I mean, can you imagine who's going to care what the sewing society is doing? But if you called yourself the Radical Underground Railroad, fighters for freedom, the community might have something to say about what you're doing. But if you just meet in some church somewhere, which most of them did, and you sewed together and prayed together and sang together, who's going to oppose you? Nobody. And so, in fact, this is one of the problems with my research, is that as I'm trying to find all of these female anti-slavery societies, I find that, in fact, many sewing societies were just sewing societies. And so I have to look through the records of all these sewing societies to find the ones that were really the Radical Underground Railroad riders, versus they were just sewing together. So it's kind of a problem for women's historians. Not all women, however, remain so comfortable within the women's sphere like our sewing societies. There were some women on the Underground Railroad, like Laura Haviland, pictured here, who engaged in untraditional activities during her reign as one of the leading conductors on the Underground Railroad in the Midwest. During the early 1840s, Haviland lived with her husband and 8 children in Raisin, Michigan. Their home became a station on the Underground Railroad, and they opened up a school for youth of any race or sex that taught abolitionist principles. But tragedy struck in 1845. Laura lost her husband, 1 daughter, and her parents to illness. This devastating loss left Laura feeling empty and isolated, as you might imagine. It also left her with 7 children and significant debt. And how did she respond? She devoted herself full-time to the Underground Railroad. How else? She often traveled across the Midwest to help fugitives escape north to Canada. She even made several daring trips into the South, which was very risky, to garner information, deliver messages, or aid in escapes. She became so well known for her fearlessness and her brilliance in aiding fugitives that a $3,000 reward was offered for her capture by the state of Kentucky. And $3,000 was a lot of money at this time period. So the state of Kentucky was looking for Laura Haviland. As you can see here, she doesn't look like a real dangerous radical, does she? Pictured here with some of the remnants of slavery. Here's an elderly Laura Haviland. Many of these episodes of violence she describes in her autobiography, which I have kind of blistered here. The main title is A Woman's Life Work. I will mention that this is a really long autobiography, but it's actually really interesting. Of course, with all autobiographies, you have to take it with a grain of salt. And as historians reading these autobiographies, we generally try and find more evidence to corroborate what Laura Haviland says, as opposed to just taking her word for it. But anyway, she had a number of incidents involving violence, for example, on the Underground Railroad that she describes in her autobiography. And I'm just going to give you an example of one of her interactions that involve some threat of violence. And I'm giving you this example because you'll see that it's quite typical of women involved on the Underground Railroad. In 1846, Laura's Michigan neighbors, Elsie and Willis Hamilton, came to her for help. Willis had been a slave, but he had been freed by a repentant owner. His wife, Elsie, was not freed. She was also a slave, but she was an escaped slave. She was a fugitive. They received a letter from someone purporting to be from someone purporting to be Willis's former owner, the one who willingly freed him, offering them information about their 2 children who remained enslaved. Okay, so they get this letter. Supposedly it's from Willis's former repentant owner saying, I have information for you about your 2 children. Come meet me in Toledo, Ohio, and I'll give you that information. They're up in Michigan. Now, they're a little suspicious. Remember, Elsie's a fugitive, right? So, they go to Laura. They know Laura's a very brilliant person involved with the Underground Railroad, and they say, Laura, what do you think about this? And she says, it's a ruse. It's a ruse to get Elsie back. It's probably with the minor slave owner. Don't go. And they said, but it's our children. We have to go. We don't care if it's a ruse. We have to go. So Laura basically says, I'll make a deal with you. Don't go, but I will go with this guy that kind of looks like Willis. Okay, so she's a white woman. She gets on a train down from Toledo with this free African-American man who isn't Willis Hamilton, but looks like him. And they said they go meet with these guys and check it out and see what the situation was. So they go down to Toledo, Ohio. They meet up with these guys, and it's a long story. I won't give you all the details, but there is some faking of illness involved and some craziness. But anyway, just about at the same time, they both realize that they're both faking and lying, right? So she discovers that, in fact, these really are slave owners coming to get Elsie. They discover at the same time that she and this guy are not who they think they are, and that they're abolitionists. So Laura and her friend have to make an escape, and they're about to board the train to get back up to Michigan, and the slave owners find them and they threaten them with a revolver. And Haviland apparently calmly replied to this attempt at intimidation, and she says to these guys, quote, I fear neither your weapons nor your threats. They are powerless. You are not in Tennessee. And they got on the train and came back up to Michigan. So she and her accomplice returned home safely, and they encouraged the Hamiltons to seek refuge in Canada, which they did. Laura concluded her description of this dangerous venture by noting, with quite a bit of satisfaction, that the slave catchers who had threatened her had both died soon thereafter. One was shot by a free black man, and the other fell ill with apparently an extremely painful and deadly disease. Laura Haviland was not the only Midwestern woman abolitionist to risk violence or worse. In one early case in Detroit, for example, a black female abolitionist devised a daring and perilous plan to help a fugitive woman by the name of Ruthie Blackburn, who had been recaptured and was about to be returned back south to slavery. This fearless abolitionist visited the fugitive in jail, switched clothing with her, thus allowing Ruthie Blackburn, the fugitive, to walk out and flee to Canada. The local sheriff was so incensed at this ruse that he unsuccessfully attempted to have the female abolitionist sent to Kentucky in place of the escaped slave. So literally, this woman was putting her life on the line, knowing that this could very well happen. Not long after Ruthie Blackburn had escaped, her husband was captured in Detroit again, and the sheriff was determined this time that he was going to be conveyed down south. Abolitionists were equally determined that he was not going to be taken down south. So, black women abolitionists devised a plan that they were going to take the linchpin out of the carriage that was going to be taking Blackburn down to the boat, and in the melee that would ensue, he would be whisked away in a waiting cart. Now, even though this plan unexpectedly changed because Blackburn somehow freed himself on the steps of the jail, an African-American woman saved the day. As the crowd momentarily distracted the sheriff, Blackburn was, quote, seized by an old colored woman named Sleepy Polly and dragged to the cart and spirited away. Now, this information is from a couple of newspaper reports about the incident. Sometimes women abolitionists violence, they initiated physical threats and bloody encounters. When slave catchers arrived at the door of Indiana resident Millie Wilkerson looking for her fugitive granddaughters, she held them off with a corn knife. Described as large and stout and able to handle an axe or rifle equal to any man, Millie stood her ground against the Southerners as her granddaughters escaped. This aggressive defense of fugitives was not uncommon among both white and black women abolitionists in the West. Resident of Ripley, Ohio, Aunt Polly Jackson, pictured here, she supposedly fought off slave catchers with a bottle of hot water and a butcher knife. She looks like she could hold off. When a family of brothers operating a station on the Underground Railroad in Illinois noticed a group of suspicious-looking men gathered near their home, they went to investigate. They thought the men might be Southern slave catchers. Although the young men usually carried guns, their mother insisted that they go unarmed. On their return, however, they discovered that she carried a meat axe under her apron and was prepared for a violent encounter if necessary. And yet another instance, an elderly African-American woman forced some slave catchers into a corn crib by threatening them with a knife, thus allowing 2 other fugitives to free. The women who engaged in these potentially violent episodes often justified their actions as appropriate for women. Why? Because of their moral intent, right? That morality, they could do anything. That would be their excuse. After all, they were attempting to aid those who were escaping cruel and inhumane bondage. Some female abolitionists even employed religion towards their untraditional behavior. Laura Haviland, for example, referred to her efforts to help fugitives as mission work. And she often grounded her motivations in courage and her faith that God had anointed her a special agent for this difficult and dangerous labor. And yet, her attempt to excuse her untraditional behavior through religion did not always succeed. Fellow Underground Railroad agents like Levi Coffin, who some of you might have heard of before, who was also a Midwestern conductor on the Underground Railroad, later questioned her decision to risk violence in her ventures into the South. Especially, of course, because she was a woman. Most of the women who condoned or participated in violence did not conform to the quote-unquote accepted view of the American womanhood. And yet, Laura Haviland and these other women did not perceive of themselves as being unfeminine or unladylike. They managed to adopt common notions of womanhood to fit their needs. They developed new and different ideas about femininity also, ideas which allowed them to see their bodies as forces of strength and sacrifice. Physical confrontation was not, therefore, anathema to their vision of womanhood. Indeed, all of the women that I have discussed tonight, Mary Davis, Elizabeth Chandler, Laura Haviland, only in part conformed to proper ideas about womanhood at the time. Instead, they manipulated and tweaked these notions to allow them to participate in the anti-slavery movement, driven by a deep moral obligation and a strong sense of their obligation to their slave sisters. These women contributed to the abolition movement in diverse and important ways, even as they maintained their feminine credentials. But they were changed by their activism. They began to question the restrictions placed on women and even, eventually, to challenge them. Thank you very much for being patient with me tonight. I appreciate it. I know I talked for quite a while. I'd be so happy if anybody had any questions that they wanted to ask me or comments that they wanted to make to tell you anything more that I can tell you about Garrison.
Did Mr. Garrison start out as a Quaker? Is that where he had his anti-slavery ideas?
That's an excellent question. You know, it's pretty were mostly strongly abolitionists. Definitely they were abolitionists. But the Quakers also began to feel like they did not want to associate with non-Quakers in the anti-slavery movement. So they wanted to be within themselves. So many women abolitionists who were also Quakers who wanted to join, say, a state female anti-slavery society or a local female anti-slavery society that wasn't just Quakers, they could actually really be voted out of their own groups because of the outside influence on the Quakers. And the Quakers were worried about the impact of that outside influence on their faith, on their community. And so it was a bit of an unusual role because they didn't want to get publicly involved in the movement. And so it was a little bit complicated as we moved into the 19th century. Yes.
You showed us how some of the female anti-slavery activists crossed gender lines, and you talked about politics and how they got into the Liberty Party. In your research, have you found any ways in which they crossed racial lines in anti-slavery societies? Like whether they involved people like Aunt Polly Jackson in societies or not?
That's an excellent question, Karen. In the Midwest, I don't have a lot of evidence of black women joining white women's groups, but I do have a lot of evidence of informal interactions. And most of this happens on the Underground Railroad level. What I have evidence of is, for example, the example of Laura Havland traveling with an African-American man who's not her husband this is pretty radical at the time, right? And not even pretending like he's her servant or anything, traveling as equals and working as equals in this instance. And so I have more examples of kind of informal interactions, more even interestingly enough between white women and black men than I do between white women and black women. And that's not, I don't think, because the latter relationships didn't exist. It's just because I have not found the evidence, unfortunately, of those relationships. And the evidence of those relationships is probably not going to be in public letters to newspapers like Mary Davis. It's going to be in private letters written to family members or to friends. And unfortunately, so often those letters have been destroyed or lost, or they're in somebody's attic somewhere. I keep hoping that I'm going to give one of these talks and someone's going to come up to me with a shoebox, full of letters of their great-great-great Aunt Jane, who was an abolitionist, and then I'm going to find some examples of exactly what you're talking about. So I wish I had more information. Unfortunately, I don't. Yes, sir?
Have you found any reference to the role of women in the Underground Railway as related to Washington itself?
That's an interesting question. I'm trying to think now. I'm actually right now in the middle of looking through women's letters to the Western Citizen, which is that Chicago-based Liberty Party paper I mentioned earlier. And in that paper, they mention a number of Central Illinois societies. Now, I don't think, I'm trying to think of what are the other major areas around here that, just a little bit north of Washington. And it's not Princeton, because it's like between Princeton and Peoria. I can't remember the name. It's not Sterling. There are some very, very local near Washington, but I'm not sure if I actually have any individual abolitionists in Washington. Would you know some?
Well, we just, in our library at the Historical Society, there's a number of references to the Underground Railroad here in Washington, but not necessarily to the role of women. And from what we have, what evidence we have, this was a rather important stop on the Underground.
Well, you know what's interesting is that, and this is the struggle for historians who study women's lives, is that, just like you said, we'll find these references to these underground railroad locations in Washington, but we don't actually have any women's names because the homes are usually categorized by the male owners of the homes, right? But guess who was up? Washing the clothes, making all the food those 15 slaves to stop by in the middle of the night. I mean, it was really women who were doing all the really, really laborious work involved with the Underground Railroad, but you're not going to find their names on in the Underground Railroad museums and the historical societies because they get forgotten, in part because they themselves didn't want their names to be public, but in part because they didn't consider their role to be as important as the men did. Now I know I've talked too long.
I have a question. When we first came to town, Lois and Bob Adams lived at the end of High Street, right across the end of And so when we first moved to town in '67, Lois and Bob Adams lived in the house where Tobias' house. Where Gracie lives now. Who lives there now?
Grace.
Yeah, right.
They think they're large.
Oh, I know that when Bob and Lois had some evidence of it.
Really? What kind of evidence do you know?
I don't know. I know the kids played in the dumplings at the Duncan.
Yeah.
I think there was also some sort of a tunnel underneath the house that
Yes.
they felt had been used to hide runaway slaves.
That's just a couple blocks from here.
I'll have to look into that. Maybe there's some letters.
Any other questions? We're very appreciative of this.
Oh, thank you for listening patiently to me
Very
talk about my
interesting
favorite
material.
topic. Thank you.
We have coffee, cookies. We hope you will enjoy that, to take some time to visit with one another. If you haven't done so at this point, and have not been in the Kroger store in the last week or so, we invite you to take a tour of the store. I'm not legislating for Kroger, but they came to us as a historical society, asked us to provide them with 17 to 20 photographs of Washington as it was 70 to 100 years ago. And they have developed a permanent exhibit which is on the perimeter of the walls in Kroger's. They have greatly enlarged these to very substantial size photos, and this depicts life in Washington as it used to be. It is a permanent exhibit, and we hope you will take note of it. If you have any questions about it, I'll be glad to answer those later. But thank you again for attending, and I do have some evaluation forms which are out. I'll put out on a table in the foyer, and if you can help us give some feedback to Dr. Robertson and also to the Humanities Council, we will appreciate it. Thank you very much for attending.